Tea was late afternoon, and I was tidying up my bedroom when the creak of the door startled me. I turned around quickly, and there stood Wesley, my 23-year-old stepson, framed in the doorway. His gaze was locked on the object in my hands, and for a split second my heart felt like it stopped altogether. How was I supposed to explain this? The item was anything but innocent, a large, brightly colored toy, glaringly obvious and impossible to brush off in polite conversation. I'd only pulled it out to dust behind the cabinet without giving it a second thought. I could have sworn I'd locked the door, but apparently not. Wesley, who worked at a local brewery and usually stayed out late with his friends after his shift, wasn't even supposed to be home yet. But there he was, tall and lanky, with dark hair falling lazily into his sharp, amused blue eyes. "What's that?" he asked, his tone hovering somewhere between curious and teasing. My face went crimson, and I dropped the object as though it had burned me. Without thinking, I snatched up the nearest thing, a throw pillow from the bed, and used it to cover the item. "It's none of your business," I stammered, my throat tightening as heat spread up my neck. But Wesley's smirk didn't waver. If anything, he leaned against the doorframe, looking even more intrigued. "You know, you don't have to act so embarrassed," he said with an irritatingly casual tone. "It's not like I've never seen one of those before." I wanted the ground to swallow me whole. The audacity of this kid, well man, really, to stand there like it was the most normal thing in the world while my brain felt like it was short-circuiting. Forcing a laugh, I tried to diffuse the tension. "Wesley, seriously, just mind your own business. You shouldn't even be in here." But he didn't budge. The silence between us grew heavy and unbearable. When I dared to glance at him, I realized his gaze had shifted. It wasn't the usual carefree or playful look I was used to. This one lingered too long, felt too intense, like he was seeing something in me he hadn't seen before. It made my stomach turn, a strange warmth flickering in my chest before guilt stabbed through me like a blade. Whatever this was, it was wrong. So wrong. I was his stepmother, for God's sake. I was married to his father. Shaking my head, I broke the silence with a firm, "Please, Wesley, just go." Finally, he shrugged, raising his hands in mock surrender. All right, he said lightly. But as he turned to leave, he gave me one last look, a look that sent my already tangled thoughts spiraling even further. When the door clicked shut behind him, I collapsed onto the edge of the bed, clutching the pillow like a lifeline. My heart raced as I stared at the item I still couldn't bring myself to put away. It felt like the air between us had shifted somehow, something invisible but unmistakable, and no matter how much I wanted to pretend it hadn't happened, I knew I'd never look at Wesley the same way again. For the rest of the evening, the moment replayed in my head on a loop. I tried everything to distract myself, making dinner, folding laundry, sitting next to Victor on the couch while he watched yet another old Western, but it was no use. Wesley's amused smirk, the unsettling glint in his eye, refused to leave my mind. Victor, of course, didn't notice my distraction. He rarely did anymore. Ever since his retirement, he'd been absorbed in his hobbies: gardening, woodworking, crossword puzzles. I didn't resent him for it. Resentment would have been too simple. But sometimes I felt more like his caretaker than his wife. At one point, I glanced down the hallway and saw Wesley's shadow moving around in his room. The low hum of music seeped through his door, the steady bass line a sharp contrast to the stillness of the house. My heart jumped for no good reason, and I quickly turned my attention back to Victor. He'd fallen asleep in his recliner again, head tilted forward, snoring softly. The TV droned on, but I didn't bother waking him. What would have been the point? Instead, I wandered into the kitchen, grateful for a moment to myself. But I wasn't alone for long. Wesley walked in, his steps silent on the hardwood floor. He was wearing a faded t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair tousled like he'd just run his hands through it. "Hey," he said casually, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. "You're up late." "I could say the same about you," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. He smiled faintly, leaning against the counter. "Just unwinding, you know? It's not exactly easy living under this roof sometimes." His comment caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" I asked, genuinely curious. He shrugged, though there was a flicker of something serious in his eyes. "It's nothing. Just being here again, I guess. Feels like I don't fit anymore." Despite everything, I felt a pang of sympathy. "It's only temporary, Wesley. I said softly. You'll figure things out. You're smart and capable. You'll land on your feet. Thanks, Karen, Wesley said softly, his voice quieter now. I really mean it. For a moment, neither of us moved. The kitchen seemed smaller, like the walls were closing in, and the space between us felt charged with something unspoken. His gaze lingered on mine, and there it was again, that faint flicker of warmth in my chest, so unwelcome yet impossible to ignore. I quickly cleared my throat and busied myself wiping the counter, desperate to shake off the strange tension building between us. But Wesley wasn't ready to let it go. About earlier, he began, his tone turning playful again. You really don't need to feel so awkward about it. I mean, come on, we're all human, right? My hand froze mid-wipe, and I turned to face him, struggling to keep my voice steady. Wesley, let's not bring that up, okay? It was an accident. Nothing worth talking about. Okay, he said, raising his hands as if in surrender, though the teasing edge in his smile didn't fade. My stomach tightened as he stepped past me, close enough that I caught the faint, woody scent of his cologne. I didn't look back, but I could feel his presence lingering behind me for a moment before he finally left the kitchen. That night, as I lay in bed next to Victor, my mind wouldn't stop spinning. What was happening to me? To us? To this house? I'd always prided myself on maintaining clear boundaries, lines you don't cross, no matter what. But Wesley had a way of bending those lines effortlessly, like it was second nature. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I wanted him to stop. The next morning I tried my best to play it cool. I stuck to the usual routine: eggs, toast, and coffee for Victor, a smoothie for myself. Wesley was the last one to stroll into the kitchen, as always, his damp hair still messy from his shower. He greeted Victor with a casual morning, but when his eyes landed on me, he smiled in a way that made my pulse quicken. We sat at the table, the clinking of silverware and the occasional small talk filling the air. But underneath it all I could feel it, that quiet tension humming just beneath the surface. Every time his hand brushed against mine while passing the salt or refilling coffee, I felt a jolt. It didn't feel accidental. More than once I caught him watching me, his gaze steady and unreadable. Victor, as usual, noticed none of this. After breakfast, Wesley surprised me by offering to help with the cleanup. Normally, he'd vanish into his room or make plans with friends, so his offer caught me completely off guard. You don't have to, I said, already stacking plates in the sink. I want to, he replied, grabbing a dish rag before I could protest. We worked side by side in silence, but it wasn't the comfortable kind. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something neither of us wanted to name. At one point I reached for a glass just as he did, and our hands collided. Neither of us pulled back right away. You're different, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at him, my throat suddenly dry. What do you mean? He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. I don't know. You're not like other women your age. I laughed nervously, taking a step back to put some space between us. Well, that's flattering, I guess. It's not just that, he continued, his tone more serious now. You're real. You actually listen to people, and you see them for who they are. The sincerity in his words caught me off guard. I didn't know how to respond, so I turned back to the dishes, scrubbing with more force than necessary. But I could feel him standing behind me, so close I could sense his warmth. My heart was racing again, and I hated how much I wanted him to stay there. Before I could process the moment, Victor's voice called out from the living room. Karen, where's my crossword book? The spell shattered instantly. Wesley stepped back, offering me a small, knowing smile. I'll let you get back to him, he said lightly before walking away. As he left, I felt a strange mix of relief and longing. I knew I was dangerously close to crossing a line, but there was a part of me that couldn't stop leaning into the fire. Later that afternoon, I threw myself into errands, anything to keep my thoughts at bay. But when I got home, I found Wesley sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the yard. His usual confident demeanor was gone, replaced by something quieter, almost lost. Hey, I said softly, walking up to him. He looked up, a small smile breaking through his pensive expression. Hey, everything all right? I asked, lowering myself onto the steps, careful to leave some space between us. He hesitated before answering. Yeah, just thinking, I guess. Thinking about what? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Life. Where I'm headed. Where I should be headed. I nodded, understanding more than I cared to admit. That's a lot to unpack, I said lightly. He chuckled, though it lacked any real humor. Yeah, tell me about it. I stayed beside him, not saying much, just offering a quiet presence. The warmth of his nearness was impossible to ignore, even as I told myself I had no business feeling it. You're still young, Caleb, I said softly, trying to inject some optimism into my voice. You don't have to have everything figured out yet. He stayed quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the yard as if the answers were hidden somewhere out there. Then, almost as if he were speaking to himself, he said, maybe. But, you ever feel like you're stuck in the wrong story? Like you were meant for something else, something completely different? His words struck a chord I wasn't prepared for. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him that everything would work out, but the truth was I didn't even believe that for myself. Instead, I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. You're not stuck, I said, though my voice betrayed a faint tremor. For a fleeting moment, his hand covered mine, and the simple gesture felt far too intimate. My heart raced as I pulled away, the boundary between us blurring even further. I didn't know how to stop it anymore. That evening, the sky darkened with the threat of an approaching storm. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Victor had gone to bed early, muttering about his shoulder acting up again. I curled up in the living room with a book, trying to distract myself, but the words on the page blurred as my restless thoughts kept circling back to Caleb. From the kitchen, I could hear him rummaging through the fridge, the faint clinking of glass as he poured himself a drink. Moments later, he appeared in the doorway, holding 2 glasses. Whiskey, he offered, raising one in my direction. I blinked, caught off guard. I don't usually drink this late, I said hesitantly. Well, he said with a casual grin, maybe tonight's an exception. Without waiting for a response, he handed me the glass. I hesitated but took it anyway, the cool glass pressing against my palm. Caleb sank into the armchair across from me, stretching his legs out in a way that seemed far too relaxed. The soft glow of the lamp highlighted the sharp lines of his jaw and the faint stubble along his chin. What are you reading? He asked, nodding toward the book in my lap. Just something light, I replied, holding it up briefly. Nothing exciting. He smirked, his eyes sparkling with amusement. I find that hard to believe. I laughed softly, taking a small sip of the whiskey. It burned as it went down, but the warmth was oddly welcome. A distraction from the tension that seemed to linger no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. For a while we sat in silence, the sound of rain pattering against the windows and distant rumbles of thunder filling the space. But then he broke the quiet, his voice low and tentative. Can I ask you something? I glanced at him warily. Depends on what it is. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, staring into it as if the answer was hidden at the bottom. Do you ever feel stuck? The question startled me. It was so similar to what he'd asked earlier, but this time it carried more weight, like he was reaching for something deeper. Sometimes, I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. He looked up then, his eyes meeting mine. You don't seem like someone who should be stuck. You're too alive for that. Heat crept up my neck, and I quickly averted my gaze, setting my glass down on the coffee table. Caleb, you shouldn't say things like that. Why not? He asked, his tone soft but insistent. It's true. The air between us grew thick with unspoken meaning, and I stood abruptly, needing to create some distance. I think it's time we called it a night, I said, avoiding his eyes. But before I could leave the room, the power went out. The sudden darkness disoriented me, and I froze mid-step. Oh, I muttered, my voice shaky. It's just the storm, Caleb said, his voice calm and steady. I heard him rise from the chair, the soft shuffle of his feet on the carpet. Hold on. I'll find a flashlight. I felt him move closer, his presence a quiet reassurance in the dark. Then his hand brushed against mine, and I sucked in a sharp breath. Sorry, he murmured, but his hand didn't pull away. Instead, it lingered warm against mine, and the space between us seemed to shrink. Caleb, I whispered, my voice trembling. Karen, he replied softly, his voice impossibly close. I turned toward him, even though I couldn't see him in the pitch-black room. But I could feel him, his warmth, his steady breathing, the energy that seemed to radiate from him like a magnetic pull. His hand slid up to my wrist, holding it gently. "This is a bad idea," I managed to say, my voice barely audible. "I know," he murmured, but he didn't let go. A sudden crack of lightning lit up the room for a brief second, and in that moment, I saw his face, open, vulnerable, and far too close. And then he kissed me. The kiss started soft, tentative, as if he was giving me the chance to push him away. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself leaning into him, my hands gripping the fabric of his shirt like it was the only solid thing in a world spinning out of control. When the lights flickered back on, we broke apart, both of us breathing hard. Reality hit me like a wave, and I stumbled back, my hands trembling. "This can't happen," I said firmly, shaking my head. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to sound resolute. Dylan didn't argue. He just stood there, his expression calm yet unreadable. "I know," he said quietly, his voice steady, though the weight of his words made my chest tighten. "But the damage is already done." The next few days passed in a haze of stolen glances and tense silences. I did everything I could to avoid him, immersing myself in chores, errands, and any mundane task that would keep my mind too occupied to replay the memory of his lips on mine. But it didn't work. No matter how much I scrubbed, folded, or cooked, I couldn't forget the warmth of his hand lingering on my wrist or the way his voice seemed to echo in my head long after he'd left the room. One evening, as I stood in the guest room folding laundry, Dylan appeared in the doorway. His presence startled me, and my hands froze mid-fold. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but firm. I didn't look up. "There's nothing to talk about." "Yes, there is," he countered, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. I sighed, setting the laundry down on the bed and finally meeting his gaze. "Dylan, whatever this is, it has to stop. It's wrong." "Is it?" he asked, his tone calm but challenging. "Because it doesn't feel wrong to me." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to keep my composure. "You don't understand. If Henry ever found out—" "He won't," Dylan interrupted sharply. "And even if he did, do you honestly think he'd care? He barely notices you anymore." The sting of his words made my breath hitch, because they weren't entirely untrue. But that didn't make them right. "This isn't about him," I said, my voice rising slightly. "It's about us. About the fact that whatever this is, can't happen. It's not just wrong. It's impossible." Dylan stepped closer, his eyes locked on mine. "Why? Because you're scared of what people might think? Or are you scared of what you might think?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. His questions hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. "Emily," he said softly, his voice losing its edge, "I'm not trying to make this harder for you, but I can't pretend I don't feel something for you. And I don't think you can either." Tears prickled the corners of my eyes and I looked away. "You don't understand," I whispered. "Then explain it to me," he pleaded, his tone raw and unguarded. But I couldn't. I couldn't explain the tangled mess of guilt, fear, and longing that had taken root inside me. So instead I shook my head, brushing past him and leaving the room without another word. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while Henry slept soundly beside me. His soft, even breathing filled the room, but it couldn't quiet the storm raging inside me. My mind churned, replaying everything, every word, every glance, every moment that had pushed me closer to the edge. Eventually, I got up and crept into the hallway, hoping that a glass of water might help calm my nerves. But as I reached the kitchen, I froze. Dylan's door was open, and he was standing there, leaning casually against the doorframe as though he'd been waiting for me. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and familiar. I shook my head, unable to muster a response. For a long moment we just stared at each other, the silence between us thick and electric. Then, without another word, I turned and walked back to my room, closing the door firmly behind me. But even as I climbed back into bed, I knew deep down that this wasn't over. Whatever this was, this dangerous, impossible thing, it wasn't going away. And worse, I wasn't sure I wanted it to. The next time it happened, there wasn't a storm to blame or a power outage to hide behind. It was deliberate. It started in the laundry room of all places. I was pulling warm towels from the dryer, letting the mundane rhythm of folding them give me a brief reprieve from the chaos in my head. The house was quiet. Henry had gone to a friend's house to watch the game, and I thought I was alone. Then I heard the faint creak of the floorboards behind me. "You're always working," Dylan said lightly, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. I didn't turn around. "Someone has to," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. He chuckled softly, the sound low and warm. "Fair enough. But don't you ever get tired of it?" "Tired of what?" I asked, my hand still methodically folding. "Tired of taking care of everything. Taking care of everyone." He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "When's the last time someone took care of you?" His words hit me harder than I expected, and I froze, clutching a freshly folded towel against my chest like it was some kind of shield. Finally, I turned to face him. "Dylan," I said carefully, my voice trembling slightly, "I don't think this is a conversation we should be having." "Why not?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. He looked relaxed, but his eyes betrayed him. They were sharp and unrelenting, piercing through every wall I tried to put up. "Because," I stammered, "it's not appropriate." "Appropriate?" he repeated, the word rolling off his tongue like a challenge. "That's not the same as honest, though, is it?" I opened my mouth to respond, to shut this down before it spiraled out of control again. But before I could, Dylan took a step closer, bridging the gap between us. The air around us seemed to shift, heavy with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. "You don't have to pretend with me, Lauren," Dylan said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made my chest tighten. "I see you. I see how you hold this house together. How you keep everything running while everyone else just takes from you. Don't you think you deserve something for yourself?" My throat tightened, and I instinctively stepped back until the edge of the counter pressed against my hips. "Dylan, whatever this is, it has to stop," I said, my voice shaking but firm. Then he reached out, his hand brushing gently against mine. Such a small, seemingly innocent gesture, yet it felt like the ground beneath me was shifting. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I opened my mouth trying to say something, anything, but no words came. I couldn't tell him that. I couldn't lie to him, or to myself. And then, just like that night in the living room, he kissed me. But this time I didn't stop him. The days that followed blurred into a whirlwind of stolen glances, hurried touches, and whispered secrets. We were careful, or at least we thought we were. Dylan always found reasons to linger near me. Helping with dinner, fixing a loose cabinet hinge, or offering to join me on errands. At first, it was exhilarating, the rush of something forbidden coursing through my veins. But as the reality of what we were doing set in, it became harder to ignore the weight of it all. I knew it couldn't last. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. One afternoon, as I was unpacking groceries in the kitchen, Dylan came up behind me and slid his arms around my waist. My body stiffened immediately, and I glanced nervously toward the doorway. "Dylan," I hissed, trying to pull away. "Henry could walk in any second." "He's at the hardware store," Dylan said calmly, his grip unwavering. "Relax." But I couldn't relax, not anymore. The paranoia was eating me alive. Every time Henry looked at me, I wondered if he knew. Every time Claire, our nosy neighbor, waved at me from across the street, I felt like she could see right through me. I turned to face Dylan, shaking my head. "We need to talk," I said, my voice trembling. "About what?" he asked, his expression carefully neutral. "About this. About us," I replied, barely able to meet his gaze. His jaw tightened, and for the first time I saw a flicker of anger in his eyes. "What about us?" he asked, his tone sharper than I'd ever heard. "This has to stop," I said, forcing the words out even though they felt like splinters in my throat. "It's too risky. It's not fair to Henry." "Fair to Henry?" Dylan scoffed, his voice rising in disbelief. "What about fair to you? Do you even hear yourself? You're so busy worrying about him that you don't even stop to think about what you want." "What I want doesn't matter," I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. "That's bullshit," Dylan shot back, his voice raw with frustration. "You deserve to be happy, Lauren. You deserve to be with someone who actually sees you." His words hit me like a gut punch, leaving me momentarily speechless. As deep down I knew he was right. The breaking point came a few weeks later. Henry had invited Claire and her husband over for dinner, and I was doing my best to play the role of the perfect hostess. But Claire's sharp eyes seemed to follow me all night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something. After dinner, as I was cleaning up in the kitchen, Claire cornered me. "You've been awfully distracted lately," she said casually, though her eyes were far from casual. "Just busy," I replied, forcing a smile. "You know how it is." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Does Henry know?" My blood ran cold, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "No," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. She shrugged, her expression unreadable. "Whatever's going on with you and Dylan?" "I don't know what you're talking about," I interrupted quickly, my voice trembling. Claire smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just be careful, Lauren. Secrets have a way of coming out." That night her words haunted me. I felt trapped, like I was teetering on the edge of two worlds that couldn't coexist. The next morning Dylan found me in the garden, pulling weeds with more force than necessary. "You're avoiding me," he said, his voice calm but laced with frustration. "I'm trying to protect us," I replied, not looking up. "Protect us from what?" he asked, stepping closer. "From this blowing up in our faces," I said, standing and wiping my hands on my jeans. "Claire knows, Dylan. She knows." His expression darkened. "How could she know?" "I don't know, but she does," I said, my voice rising. "And if she tells Henry?" "She won't," he said firmly. "You don't know that." I snapped, the fear and frustration bubbling over. "You don't understand how dangerous this is." Dylan grabbed my hand, his grip strong but not forceful. "What I understand is that I don't want to lose you." The raw emotion in his voice caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. "You won't," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "But we have to be careful, for both our sakes." The tension between us was palpable in the days that followed. Claire didn't say anything to Henry, at least not that I knew of, but her suspicion hung over me like a storm cloud. Dylan tried to reassure me, but even he seemed more on edge than usual. Then one evening Henry came home earlier than expected. I was in the laundry room with Dylan, standing far too close to him, our hushed conversation laced with the kind of tension that only made the air heavier. When we heard the front door open, we sprang apart like guilty teenagers. "Lauren," Henry called, his voice echoing through the house. "In here," I replied, forcing my voice to stay steady despite the panic clawing at my chest. Henry appeared in the doorway moments later, his eyes sweeping the room. For a brief second I thought he might say something, but then he just nodded. "Dinner ready?" he asked. "Almost," I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. He left without another word, but the look he gave me lingered long after he was gone. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment in the laundry room, the way Henry's eyes had lingered on me just a second too long. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't walk away. Whatever this was between Dylan and me, it was too consuming, too impossible to let go. But I knew the storm wasn't over. It was just beginning.